You know, as I was listening to the conversations out there, I could almost hear Professor Smith's voice talking about some Midwest governor hot-footing it to Washington, D.C. in order to meet with the president and being told he has to cool his heels at the Willard Hotel for 3 days before he can get in. Some of those phrases and that unique voice that we all remember bring us here. Kathy's asked me to make a couple of points ahead of time. One is that the baby shoes you see over there, they're genuine. They're not phony baloney. They're the real ones. Same ones that are on the poster there and the same ones you may have seen cycling here in this absolutely wonderful slideshow that we've been seeing up here. The second is, for those of you that got to go to Professor Smith's house to talk about the Civil War course, he used to take the posters from the Civil War home with him. And those original posters are the ones you're seeing here. Again, they weren't remade. In fact, I think the original duct tape is there. And so this is a lesson in authenticity. But today we're gathered here to honor and celebrate the life of a superb teacher, colleague, friend, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, family person, Christian gentleman, intellectual, American citizen. Dick Smith made a positive impact on all of our lives in different ways, and many of you will want to share your memories as we go through the memorial service today. They will vary, they'll be different, they'll be special, and they will highlight the many different relationships that we're celebrating today. I go back, like only a few of us that I've run into here, to a time when a relatively young still professor in his 30s, believe it or not, we're talking about 101, in his 30s, would come in the door, get up to the lectern, open up his notes, and suddenly 30 pencils would go up in the air, and people would try in vain to keep up with the points of his lecture. My problem was, you know, my friend Dan Nelson there could take the most beautiful notes I've ever seen in my life. If I wrote as fast as Dan wrote, I wouldn't be able to tell a single word after the fact. And what I really wanted to do was sit back there and listen to Professor Smith talk about Preston Brooks hitting Charles Sumner over the head with a cane in the U.S. Senate and just pretend it was a movement in a Schubert symphony, but that would not have worked well when exam time came up. And so fortunately, I could always go to Dan afterwards and say, Dan, could I check your notes here? You know, that young professor made such a difference in the lives of so many people. And somebody asked me, you know, there were so many great teachers at Ohio Wesleyan. What was the difference between Dick Smith and those other wonderful teachers? And the only word I could come up with was inspiration. He had a way of inspiring people. I mean, how many liberal arts college professors sent that many people off to doctoral programs in that period because somehow, I won't say he fooled us because we had wonderful careers and lives, somehow had gotten us to believe that this was a path to follow. So he had all those other virtues we expect from great professors, but there was an element of sincere inspiration there that made a huge difference to all of us. One thing all of us know, one thing in that time all of us knew, if you were working in a senior seminar with him and you got back your paper with a half a dozen comments on what you needed to do to make it rise to his standard, but in the process he said, But John, old man, there's an awful lot of good work in this paper. You glowed, and the reason you glowed was that he had called you old man. And I don't know what he did with the women students. Anne, what did he say to you? You were a wonderful student. But we knew that if he called you old man, you had somehow made it. You had made it. But let me actually conclude my comments by returning to something I said early on, and that he was always a wonderful family man. He loved his family. And in fact, we don't think of Dick Smith. We think of Dick and Betty Smith. Yes. Over 70 years, beloved partner, made such a difference. So many of the things Dick accomplished and that we admire wouldn't have happened without Betty being there next to him. It also meant Kathy and David and Rebecca and grandchildren, and now their great-grandchildren. And as we think of that family, let us also remember Dick's wonderful brother, Dave. Dave, Dick was one of the great university professors of our time. And Dave Smith was one of the great pediatric medical researchers of our time. I won't go into the details of it. Those of you that know his career know it. And Dick was so proud of his brother's accomplishments. And the thing about, Dave was on the science side of academia. Dick was on the humanities side of academia. They both thought of themselves as liberal arts people, graduates of liberal arts colleges, and liberal arts never meant to them the humanities. Liberal arts and liberal arts colleges were where you went to study those areas of study that liberalized your mind, that opened you up, that broadened you to everything in your world out there. Even though they went in different professional directions, they were both folks of the liberal arts. Now, Dick might occasionally complain that the science faculty at Ohio Wesleyan were getting advantages that the historians didn't get. We understand that. But believe me, he valued their importance and their centrality to a liberal arts education at Ohio Wesleyan. So he was a very passionate man. He was always passionate about learning in all areas. And, he might get just as excited talking with you about some development in medical research or something about a tree or a pesky, some kind of critter in the Adirondacks, as he would talking about a Methodist church in Warren, Ohio, or Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. He could talk passionately about things he had studied in so many areas. And of course, those years in the Adirondacks, those vacation times, were so dear to him for two reasons. One is it's when he brought the family together. That's when they could all come in, that wonderful family, and get together in the Adirondacks, those vacations. But he also kind of created a new family there, and that always happened with him. He has a group here from the days in the Adirondacks, just as there are people here representing so many other parts of his life. But lest I fall victim to that disease that Dick and I both had, as my bride here knows, and, have Betty look at Dick and Kay look at me as the telephone call is going into its second hour and pointing at our watch and saying, "Don't you think that's long enough?" And without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Chaplain John.
One of Richard's childhood playmates was a fellow he called Confucius. And I believe him. He would say to me, "Confucius, said about planning, if you want to plan for one day, plant rice. If you want to plan for 1 year, or 10 years rather, plant a tree. If you want to plan for 100 years, teach a child. And I said, yes, Richard, and if you want to plan for 1,000 years, teach history. One thing that Richard and I had in common was our love of this place. Over the last 38 years, I have portrayed the founder, Adam Poe, on many occasions. What most people don't know is that Richard was my resource. And the thing that he and I believed most passionately was the founding mission statement of Ohio Wesleyan in 1842. We are to be always teaching on the most liberal of principles and open to all people. That's who Richard Smith was. And I had the privilege of sitting with him in faculty meetings where he would always lean over and explain to me what was happening. And then for decades, sitting with him in Shakespeare Club, where he would lean over and explain to me what was happening. And I always listened and listened and listened, because Richard had a way, not just with words, but with wit and with wisdom, to share insights that I never would have thought of on my own. Now I have the great privilege of bringing you to the inside story as I share with you the eulogy statement written by his beloved daughter, Catherine. And the only word of warning I have to share is that this is Richard's daughter. So just sit back. We're going to be all right. So here we go. A key to understanding my father is to know that he was raised as a Congregationalist, also known as a modern Puritan. Life was serious business. He wouldn't mow the grass on Sundays, and he didn't want the people we hired to mow the grass on Sundays either. Though the First Presbyterian Church's windows should be clear glass, according to him, instead of stained glass, even though there aren't any saints or figures in them, he wouldn't even let me buy a cross necklace as a souvenir in New Brunswick. Richard, I'm sorry. I promised you I wouldn't wear fancy colors. Forgive me, man. Old man. Richard asked me to do this 30 years ago when he was just 70 years old and I was in my 40s. And he said, I don't know how much longer I've got to live, John, so I want to make sure you get you signed up now. So, here we go. Plain living, humility, hard work, being the very best that you can be. Much is expected from those who receive any gifts, such as an IQ higher than most. So service to others was a key value. His father walked for miles when gas was too expensive to downtown Canton, Ohio, to vouch for his African-American students' character if anyone were contending with them with law enforcement. And there's our grandmother's funeral. There were strangers older than my father expressing condolences for her. She had been there, they had been her students. And grandmother's Sunday school classes for decades before. We had to schedule family visits around her Sunday school curriculum. And Dad's well-honed perfectionism really raised its head when he took photos. As you can see from some of the images in the sideshow, he'd use any or all of us as photo props to document relative distances or the size of a cannon. And he would trench depths for his students. I can assure you that the length of time the three of us had to wait for every person and vehicle to get out of the photo frame for landscape shots, a year of our lives, decades for Mother, Dad never stopped teaching unless he was questioning instead. His dentist's reception once said that she learned something new every time he had an appointment. Someone said he never met a stranger. And the folks at the fairgrounds, the election polling center, looked forward, for Pete's sake, to just hearing him talk about the background behind that candidate. This also implies that he could and did Shanghai ordinary passersby as they went about their business to either say hello, ask a question, or make a joke. He actually did say to me one time waiting at Bob Evans, and I said, "You know what time it is?" And he said, "I can tell you about the history of watchmaking." Dad enjoyed asking folks leaving a restaurant as we entered, "Leave any for us?" And several years ago, while he was still driving, he went into the Hamilton Williams building where we are right now on campus just to ask a simple question at the info desk. Waiting in line, the student behind him recognized him from a Civil War lecture. They started chatting. When Dad got into the front line at the line, the person at the desk joined in the chat, which was eventually expanded to include yet another student. Students behind him in line probably remember. The last one asked if he could come to the house sometime, but he never did. If I'd known his name, I could have given him a ride. Not everyone was a fan. Not everyone in the family was always a fan. Probably my least favorite memory of both my parents was the moment I realized they had once again failed to meet me at the airport gate. This time was important because I was relocating back into the mainland after living 9 years in Honolulu. My 4- and 6-year-old kids were all jet-lagged as much as I was. I packed as much as I could in carry-on bags for 3, so all of the bags were consequently too heavy for them. I was furious as I herded the kids from the furthest gate possible back in 1998 towards the exit on the other side of the airport, while barely managing to carry everything. There was no rental baggage carts to be found. How could Mom and Dad stand me up on such an important and emotional day. I might have physically attacked them if I'd had the energy and a free hand when we finally met. They hadn't made it past the first gate. They had turned to me with happy smiles, bubbling with information gained from talking to a cab driver from West Virginia who was waiting for a fare. Dad was especially interested in talking to people who were curious and also alert to the world. With his photographic memory, he could remember conversations with specific individuals, no matter how long ago they transpired. The talk he had with my cousin, Jennifer Smith's new father-in-law, at her wedding in 1994 was something he recalled in detail years later. However, what impressed me the most was his instant ability to remember what else happened in the world on a specific time or era. He retired early at age 63 in 1986 because he was convinced he would die. So in his 60s, as his father and his grandfather did. Yet until his late 80s and early 90s, he could still remember who avoided taking a course from him, who took which course, what grade they received, where they usually sat in class, which member of a couple got better grades. He didn't tell. And usually, what was their subject for a semester paper? I don't know how he carried such a heavy load back at Ohio Wesleyan. He carried 300 students one semester, but the load was usually 200 to 250. With the change to the quarter system, he had to cap that number of students in his classes at 35 per class, and still there was a waiting list. I decided to count the number of students that he instructed. It's a duplicated count with some people more than one class, but the answer is a few over 6,000 students between 1950 and 1986. That's a lot of grading, people. His midterms and finals could include, remember, John? Matching, fill in the blank, true false, short answer, a couple short essay questions, a big essay question, and if the student was really lucky, a blank map of the continental United States upon which you had to pinpoint certain locations. This was on top of reading a book, submitting a report weekly, plus pop quizzes just to keep them on their toes. He graded on a strict bell curve, which meant that even the very good students didn't necessarily receive an A or even an A-. He lived when he found out he was livid when he found out a fraternity, he could tell you which one, had a test file with previous exam questions. This made it dangerous for every student after that, since he was determined to stump anyone trying to gain an advantage through a fraternity file quiz. He continued his command of knowledge. It could be intimidating. One student looked at Dad's podium after he'd taught a 3-hour session on a weekend so that they could all catch up. It was an index card with 4 words on it. He usually taught without any notes whatsoever. Another former student called him a human encyclopedia. Today, I would call him an AI Google search. Richard Smith, Wikipedia. A student related how Dad only took attendance once, maybe twice, at the very beginning of a course. However, he actually knew who was there on any given day, telling a friend of hers one time that he wouldn't change a grade because if you'd been in class that day, you would have known the answer. Since he had so much material he wanted to cover in one course, he gained the name Shotgun Smith. Drop your pencils and you miss the Civil War. That was the cliche. He'd greeting classes with, "And we press on." And both Jerry Corey and Dave Hobson told me they were in class the day I was born, Kathy says. They were in class the day you were born. The joke was whether mother would have a history book or a baby. What seemed to have been the book for his students was not only his passion for history, but his sincere interest in everyone. If he'd had any interaction with a student whatsoever, he'd always be able to tell you where the student came from, which sorority or fraternity, if appropriate, what was their major, their genealogy, their family faith history, where he met his parents, possibly even the parents' names, and certainly their professions, what sports teams they rooted for, and any siblings who attended Ohio Wesleyan before them. Yeah, often when siblings attended, he spent lots of time outside of class, discussing personal problems, academic issues, possible career choices. He retired in 1986. I came in 1988, so I was a newbie. But I remember my 38 years at Ohio Wesleyan, him sitting on the jaywalk, him sitting in front of Slocum Hall in the benches, talking to students late in the afternoon as a retired professor. Often wrote letters of recommendation or calling up folks around the country to ask for feedback on a particular grad school program. This was true whether or not the student was one of his advisees. Now, the rest of the story. Our life at home was a litany. A mom and dad attending former students' weddings, second weddings, anniversary parties, retirement and award ceremonies, greeting, copies of books and articles written by former students, baby announcements and sending gifts and planning trips to include visits with former students, getting calls from former students waiting to stop at the house, getting the childhood toys out for kids coming over with their parents who used to be his students, storing boxes in bins for students who were away for the summer, and the mammoth holiday card list. Dad's specific allegiance to Ohio Wesleyan was deep and personal. His mother graduated from Ohio Wesleyan in 1917. she brought him back to campus for her 10-year reunions while he was growing up, starting in 1927, before he had even turned 4. His beloved brother graduated in 1953. One of his nieces, 2 of his granddaughters, and 1 grandson-in-law are graduates. And of course, the most important graduates was his wife, Betty. Betty Jane Jackson, class of 1952. Dad had to double up and cover introductory classes in sociology when he first started at Ohio Wesleyan. And as a member of the department's faculty, he first saw Mom, a member of the sociology honorary, coming out of the kitchen with a plate of cookies during an evening meeting in 1952. It was love at first sight for Richard. Took a little longer for Mom. She was attracted to his smile, but soon they were dating in secret. For 2 people who weren't big risk takers, I've always been amazed at their swift courtship. Engagement within 3 months and marriage only 3 months after that. Over 73 years together, they were Dick Betty, a fused unit. She had to be his soulmate since he proposed with the lamest question of all times. Betty, how would you like to be buried with the Smiths? And we can all vouch that Richard wasn't one for subtlety. Everyone should know that the earth and the moon revolved around Mom. He'd praise her in front of all of us, saying, "Doesn't your mother look handsome today?" He didn't want to start eating a meal without her. He never had a clue about gifts Mother bought for us, but would always play Christmas elf for Mom, buying a gift and wrapping it up in secret. The only time he failed was that year he got you a vacuum sweeper. She was the only one who could bring him to task, just by doing that thing with her voice rises. Haven't we all heard this at some point? Emphasizing the second syllable. Richard! That's the only time I saw him be quiet. He was made an honorary Wesleyan alum in 2005, which is the cherry on top of his life besides Mom. He delivered talks to alumni all over the place, SAEs whenever they asked, developed a walking architectural tour of campus, which became standing room only, attended more reunion dinners upon request than anyone has a right to, including the class of 1975, 1 week before his stroke. He represented this school with pride at professional conferences all over the globe. He gave the rededication remarks when Merrick Hall was reopened because he was the only living professor who'd taught in that building. And both of them were even going together on a bike riding tour of Flat, Vermont in the 1980s, where he gave, of course, a presentation each night. As much as I yearned for a 9-to-5 dad, a banker dad, who would leave his work at the office, this was not the dad I got. When I lived in Hawaii, if Mom answered the phone, I could talk about work, my children, what happened to my life. If Dad answered the phone, I got to talk about Russia invading Afghanistan. His curiosity could take any direction and always ran on his own time. After impatiently waiting in an unair-conditioned car in eastern British Columbia in 1972 while filling up at the gas station, I lost it when he couldn't wait to share the info he'd gained about local annual rainfall and crop rotation. After hearing about my daughter's in-laws' 2020 Thanksgiving dinner, which featured a goose, his reaction was to muse about the goose's first appearance in America. And during our last conversation, the day of his stroke, he wanted to know more about what was happening in Ukraine, curious to the end. Fortunately, as I got older, the more useful Dad became. Helping in 2013 with Sam's paper on the Russian Revolution, I couldn't figure out why Bosnia let the Serbian Black Hand archivists cross the border in 1914, since the Secret Service knew about the plan to murder the Austrian heir. After I went to the bathroom, got a glass of water, had a couple pencils in hand, and what I thought would be enough scratch paper, I called Dad. He paused for a minute and said, "Okay, but you need to start with the Rus tribe in the 19th century." Ninth. I'm sorry. Yes, see, she remembers. You need to start with the Rus tribe in the 9th century. And after knowing our family for many years of vacation and having the same week of July up in the Adirondacks, I was completely taken aback by a question from a camp friend who asked about our long drive home. "What do you do? Listen to books on tape?" "No," I replied, "we listen to Dad." It was also possible to manipulate Dad for good. For Sam's 2011 spring break, the four of us took the Lincoln tour. We drove to Kentucky the first day and had breakfast the next morning at a fast food restaurant. After we were done eating, I started to stand up to go to the car, but Dad insisted on sitting me back down and all four of us staying longer. No idea why. Dad pulled up one napkin, opened it, took out a pen, and started to draw the early boundaries of the Kentucky Territory. After hearing about the basic geography and various tribes, he was well into the Harrodsburg settlement when I realized out of the peripheral eye vision that a middle-aged man across the room was leaning in to hear. To be nice, I began, and because my son's brain was already disengaged, I deliberately asked a few leading questions for the fellow's good benefit before we got up to leave. We don't have that answer man anymore, or his sense of humor. So I'll just close with one of my favorite memories. When Dad took the podium at the start of the very first Richard Smith Civil War lecture, he took some notes out of his pocket, adjusted the microphone, paused, touched the notes again, looked up, and with a perfect deadpan expression said, "And in conclusion,"
Good afternoon. Smith family, especially Kathy, what a wonderful occasion you have organized. Thank you so much. I am honored today to have an opportunity to remember our dear friend, Richard Williams Smith. He has been a colleague and a friend to Rosemary and me for more than 40 years. And during that time, he was always generous, consistently engaging, and steadfastly caring. I first met him in 1984 when I came to Ohio Wesleyan for an interview. And along with Bob Cragalot, he introduced me that day to lunch at Bunn's. And our wide-ranging conversation ran so long that I was rather late for my next interview with Professor Blake Michael. I learned right from the start that chatting with Dick could run long, but it was always worth it. Dick and Betty were a team. It was they who picked us up for early faculty events. They invited us on many occasions to their home where they entertained with grace and style. They took us on picnics. They took us to their woodland getaway, their trailer one time with our young children. They introduced us to the local Bobby Burns Day dinner and the tradition of piping in the haggis. And for several seasons running, we joined them and little Margaret the dog for light opera events at the College of Worcester. Dick knew a great deal of the Gilbert and Sullivan repertoire, most of the words to modern Major General, and shared many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. On drives through the Ohio countryside, Dick would point out Greek Revival architecture, sites of historical events, even pulling off the road to add just a comment or two more, until Betty gently would say, "We need to get going, dear." Dick was the product of a first-rate education. Canton McKinley High School, DePaul University, Harvard, Ohio State. He remained thoroughly imbued with the liberal arts all his life, and he could hold forth on any number of complex subjects with surprising insight. He was extraordinarily well-read. In his own field and in others, bibliography would gently fall from his lips. He knew about all the events of the day and was better informed about contemporary British politics and the monarchy than most people I know. When questions came up in department meetings, Bob Cragalot would say, "Ask the encyclopedia," referring, of course, to Dick. And even after his retirement, he was sometimes asked to join search committees, though I have no idea why he accepted. He gave the inaugural Vogel lecture on Delaware history on embarrassingly short notice, you shall never know. And in a tense moment of alumni-donor relations, set that series on the road to success with an overflow crowd of literally hundreds and a standing ovation. As a colleague, Dick was supportive, experienced, and a wise exemplar. He was always encouraging in earnest, and he was constructive in criticism. He could always find something to praise. He was wise, but judiciously sparing in his counsel. The best advice he ever gave me was, to be happy, attend fewer faculty meetings. It is as a teacher that Richard Smith had perhaps the greatest influence. He touched legions of students, prepared scores for graduate study, and saw more than a dozen earn the PhD and enter highly successful academic careers of their own. And some felt so indebted to him, they endowed an annual lecture series in his name, but I don't have to tell this crowd about that. It is no exaggeration to say that Dick Smith was an award-winning teaching legend. Well after he retired, students would ask me how to get in touch with him because their parents had said they just had to meet him. And often they would later report that they had been invited to the Smith home, provided with transportation, treated to tea or dinner, and they felt they had been to the mountaintop. When Dick retired, the department asked alumni to send in reminiscences that could be bound and presented to him. One wrote in to say, perhaps that person's here, one wrote in to say that they so much enjoyed his legendary visits to Fraternity Row, where he would end the evening with a presentation on Gettysburg. He explained the famous fishhook formation of the battlefield that was laid out on 2 dining tables, with various regiments identified by silverware, knives for cavalry units, spoons and forks for infantry or reserves, and salt and pepper shakers for artillery. Day 1, day 2, day 3. And the student recollected that twice the call had gone back to the kitchen for more cutlery. We all know how easily conversation came to Richard Smith. Once I apologized to Betty for a lengthy parking lot chat at the end of the day that I know must have gotten him home late. She shook her head and said, "You know, Richard, I've never really known when to have dinner." Dick loved his family. He cherished his adoring wife of 73 years, who is the secret of his success and was the source of his greatest happiness. And after a memorable first date, Betty just told me this recently, after a memorable first date, when the car ran out of gas, she would sometimes gently remind him later that the tank ought to be full. He was so proud of his children and grandchildren, keeping friends updated on their challenges and their many triumphs. His fine family was his greatest achievement. Though he did once try to convince me that in 1066, it was Williams, the conqueror, who had set up the regime in England. Dick faced advancing years and declining health with grace and courage and unyielding good humor. He was always grateful to see friends and went out of his way to make them feel welcome, even when he didn't feel 100%. He lived a full life, a meaningful life, a generous life, a long life, and a Christian life. It was a century well lived. And for all that, we give thanks. We miss his loyalty and his wry smile. We miss his erudition and his insights. We miss his welcoming, well, with a warm mustached grin. We miss his steadfast companionship and engaging conversation. We are all better for having known him. It is friends like this that make life worth living. Rest in peace, dear friend.
Hi, I'm Joe Gladhar, class of 1978. When Kathy asked me to speak, I wrote her back, how long? She said 2 hours. I thought, I'm no Dick Smith, so it'll only be an hour and a half. I first met Dick Smith in late August 1974 in his office, which was in Elliott Hall. It was during orientation, and I was assigned as his advisee. I have no idea who made the assignment, but I thank that person every day. The meeting was one of the most fortunate of my entire life. We didn't talk history, interestingly enough. We found common ground in football. You see, I was a big New York Jets fan, and Dick admired Joe Willie Namath and the Jets. I had always found the Browns interesting because, of course, they were better than the Giants. And I loved Jim Brown, Leroy Kelly, Frank Ryan, and, of course, Lou the Toe Groza. This laid the foundation for our future conversations. When I would go in to meet with him before each semester to pick courses, we first talked football. Then, at the end, we got around to course selection. After I left Ohio Wesleyan, we would correspond, and there was always a lengthy discussion in our letters about football and the Browns, his beloved Browns, I should say. Now, my fall semester, I took History 13, Early American History. It was hard. Anyone who took Dick Smith knew he was really a taskmaster. And I didn't do as well as I should have. But Dick thrilled me and challenged me. And I quickly decided that I would become a history major because of that. And I ended up taking every class that Dick Smith offered. The American frontier, American colonial history, Old South and slavery, the Civil War, the senior seminar, and he was my thesis advisor. All the history faculty assigned heavy workloads, but Dick Smith's courses were legendary in readings and demands. You heard a little bit about them before, but you need to understand that when I went to Ohio Wesleyan, we were on what we call trimester, 3 10-week semesters. Classes were 4 days a week. Except for Dick Smith, 5 days a week. He was the only professor I ever knew who required students to come 5 days a week. When I was at Ohio Wesleyan, Dick was widely regarded as the best teacher at the university. And over those years, 1974 to 1978, I don't recall that he won a teaching award. But he had almost perfect scores in his evaluations in every single category. I knew somebody who was on the teaching committee, and they said there was no one on the university faculty whose scores compared with Dick's. But Dick was a taskmaster. He didn't buy evaluations, he earned the evaluations. And of course, you heard about some of the assignments. I've always loved that blank map. One time, the answer was New Orleans. See, he would pose a question, you had to figure out the answer, then you had to put it on the map. And I put New Orleans, not on the Gulf of Mexico, but not far enough up the Mississippi River to satisfy Dick. Half point off. That was Dick. And of course, his exams, you have to understand, we had blue books and you had all these objective questions. And then you had to answer 2 essays. One was on a book. The other was from the lectures. And if you didn't write 5 to 6 pages on the major essay, the one from lectures, you could not possibly get an A. And you had to do all that in 50 minutes. 2 essays. The other was usually on a book that you had to read. And of course, if you didn't have 2 pages, not going to cut it. He was really, really tough. The toughest, though, was you would have to read a required book. And then you had to go to the library and pick out a book, which he had to bring in. You brought it in, he approved it. On day X, you would go in, and he would put a slip of paper on your desk telling you which book you had to review. 4 pages, 4 to 6 pages, typewritten, due the next day at class time. That's pretty tough. He was just amazing. Of course, as everybody here knows, Dick had his idiosyncrasies. He spoke in 2s and 3s. Did you ever notice that? Well, well. Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. And my favorite, though, was the way he would lecture. And, you know, everyone's mesmerized, and somebody drops a pencil, and Dick doesn't break stride. He just keeps lecturing, walks up to their desk, sticks his foot out, grabs the pen or pencil, slides it out, points down for them, and all the while he's lecturing. Or somebody's coughing, and Dick just keeps lecturing, walks up to their desk, puts a hard candy on their desk, backs off. He's just amazing. He was really a model for somebody who ended up going into the profession. I'd always planned to be a lawyer, and I applied and got admitted to law school. But the winter term, I took the required historiography course from Dick Smith. And there he exposed us to what professional historians do. He taught us not just about history, but the history of the profession, about how these individuals generated approaches and historical interpretations, how they gathered evidence, and what professional standards were. I just loved it. Spring term, I wrote my senior thesis, and of course, Dick was my advisor. By the end of the school year, I decided I didn't want to go to law school. I wanted to go to graduate school and study history. My parents weren't too crazy about that one. But, you know, you got to live your own life. They acquiesced, hoping that this was just a phase. Yeah, it's a 50-year phase. As a professor, I modeled my teaching after Dick, drawing from his syllabi, his lectures, his tests. I didn't require didn't have multiple choice, matching, and so on and so forth, plus 2 essays, but because students would have rioted. But I did model myself after him because he was the standard for greatness in my mind. And of all the classes that I had taken and all the graduate courses I had taken and all the undergraduate courses I had audited in college, he was the standard. But I could never reach that level. Fortunately, it never mattered to Dick. He was proud of me, like I was proud of him. For me, the greatest aspect of the Smith lectures was the opportunity all of us had to expose these great historians who came in to give these lectures to Dick Smith. Words cannot describe how proud I was. For example, when Jim McPherson marveled to me over how many PhDs Dick had produced. He couldn't believe it. I think Dick had produced more PhDs from undergrads than Jim McPherson had. If history teaches us where we have been as individuals and as a society, then I was a very fortunate person because Dick Smith is where I started. He has shaped my life in so many ways, and for that, I am extremely grateful. Godspeed, my friend.
How about now? You've heard the 3 lectures, now is the exam, and it's open book, oral, and this is your chance to come forward and to offer any rebuttal you have been waiting for decades to share. Also, any recollections you have I believe that the most important thing of a memorial celebration is not just recollections, but recollecting who we are in our relationship to this amazing man. So please come forward, and we will monitor this gently. You can come and set up here if you want to be close. Please state your name. Yeah, and your grade point average.
The grade point average is easy, 0.0. My name is Dick Pierce. I'm a member of class of 1963. Wow. At the very outset, before I get into the substance of what I want to say, there are three things, facts I want people to, in my generation, to recall, and those that came after us to know two of the facts for the first time. One, when we were in school, and this will come in later on, co-eds had curfews. Secondly, the person there to make sure the co-eds back were on time was Dean Audrey Parker, who I'm sure stood there every night with her stopwatch issued by the NFL saying, okay, you're 1 minute late. The third fact that never changed was Dick Smith's love for maps. I remember particularly, Joe, you talking about that when you gave the lecture series. Fast forward to, I think it was about in 1988, when the university sent out in the springtime an invitation to go for the bike ride in Vermont. And that sounded interesting to me. And the letter went on to say, and the representatives, probably still chaperones at that point, would be Professor Richard W. and Mrs. Betty Smith. That cinched it. I, with a number of other people, signed up for that. And we met, I think, the first night in Rutland, Vermont. I can't remember for sure. That we pedaled around the state to B&B to B&B. And here's, I guess, what I really, really want to get to, is each night, and other speakers alluded to this better than I can, we would ask, by any chance, Dick, would you be willing to give a little talk tonight? Shocker, he said yes. And so we would sit there and listen, and this is to Joe's point, others' point, that he imbued in us a desire to keep on learning all of our lives. Not when we're here, not the day after, not 30 days, 30 years, 40 years, keep on learning. And that brings me back to the maps, the Smith maps. Betty, correct me, did he bring maps with him on that trip? He must have brought those damn maps. He brought those. I still do not know where the Oregon Trail went, except roughly from Missouri to the west. But I came to realize what those maps were. It was not just point A and point B, but what did point A and point B mean? Was there a river running through here? What did that river mean? Would it lead to a grist mill being constructed? Would that lead to more economic advantages in that area? Later on, was it a wider road or river that was used for commodity and peoples? And later on, as the country developed to transport meat, wheat, corn, all around the country and outside the world, or to the outside the United States. So the maps were nothing more and nothing less, but importantly, a teaching tool to make us think critically, analyze, collect facts, don't listen to fake news, and then make your own determination based upon your understanding of those facts. So we all would think, and the critical thinking certainly stood me in good stead in my profession as an attorney, how to think about issues, attack them, and come to your own conclusion. And I'm happy to say that on those lectures, so we'd go to a new bed and breakfast, we'd have dinner, we'd have a lecture. It's nice to know that when we went to bed, Parker was not there, whether it was a stopwatch, and that equally importantly, the next morning before we had breakfast, Dick did not give us a test. So in conclusion, Professor Richard W. Smith, thank you. My friend Dick Smith, I will miss you.
I love you. Thank you, sir. One evening I was attending a concert in Great Chapel with Richard and Betty, and Richard leaned over to me and said, "You know, a symphonic orchestra score is a lot like a map. Everybody can see it, but not everybody can read it." And I see that Richard read maps symphonically, and often with a fugue. Next, sir. Yes, here.
Hi, my name's Doug Jackson. My dad was Betty's brother, so I'm part of the Jackson clan. There's a lot of memories of Uncle Dick, but I actually remembered one last night and was sharing it. When the Smiths would come to visit, I grew up in Rochester, New York. My two older brothers are here. They would come visit, and in this one particular occasion, we would always, anytime the Smiths came, it was a big deal. So in our house, a big deal required eating around the dining table. It was never used for anything else, ever, but for those special occasions. So this one particular time, it was summer because it was warm. So we're all sitting around the table, and we just started to eat. And I was home from college. I went to Lafayette College. I was home for college. And I went to pick up my glass, and my mom had these glass coasters that she used for special occasions. And I went to pick up my glass, and it was hot, and water had condensed on the glass, and it stuck to the bottom of the glass. This round glass coaster is sticking up here like this, and everyone sort of noticed it. And then from across the table, I hear Uncle Dick announce, "Well, let's hear if the Lafayette engineer can explain to us why that happened." Uh-oh. I have no idea. In my defense, I was a freshman, so he realized quickly that I didn't know. So he used it as a teaching moment to explain to everyone the physics principles behind the coaster sticking to the glass. And I didn't see him wink at me, but I think metaphorically he did, like, "I gotcha, don't worry about it." But it's an example to me of my relationship with Uncle Dick, because he's one of the smartest people that I've ever known. And I just enjoyed any conversation with him because he didn't make you feel embarrassed when he was talking about something and asking you questions and knew that you didn't know the answer. It's a rare quality for people who, are in that realm of, being smart, that they can just, whether it's the person who's pumping gas or, a distinguished professor somewhere, he treated everyone in those situations the same. And so I always appreciated that, and it made me want to engage with him and ask him more questions, because I knew he would never make me feel embarrassed, except maybe that one time. I mean, that was a little embarrassing, but he had my back and he covered me. But I really am gonna miss him. I'm gonna miss talking to him about anything, because he could talk about anything. But he was special.
Dick's ability to talk reminds us when we had the memorial service at Willowbrook, his pastor, Jennifer, from First Presbyterian said, "You all know Richard is a man of few words." Quite a few words.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm Dan Nelson, 63. I'm the guy that John said earlier was expert at taking notes in Dick's class. And I just wanted you to see what that note-taking did to me. I was pleased to see my good friend Dick Pierce give his some recollection, talk about maps in particular. But Dick omitted his principal claim to fame, at least at a certain stage in his life, when after an adult beverage or two, he would go on at his impersonation of Dick and of David Jennings, the other legendary professor of that era. Maybe afterward he will entertain some of you. I just wanted to add one little detail to the comment. During our senior year, I think it was during the time I was taking the seminar with him, he invited Lori, my wife, and me to his home where Betty served pizza. And it was so delicious, I thought, how can you beat this? And of course, the bar was pretty low. Having spent 3 years in a fraternity house, it didn't take very much, but it was still terrific. And so that was one of my favorite memories of the two of them together, as well as Dick's wonderful service. So thanks very much. Thank you, good sir. Bless you.
I see some others coming forward. Okay. Yeah, come up near the front here.
Yeah. So there were just a couple things I wanted to let people know about. One of the things is that even though Dad talked a good game, he really sometimes had a lot of courage that I didn't understand or recognize. And I didn't have any idea how fast he was out of the box. But at his very first faculty meeting, and he hadn't even finished his dissertation yet, he brought up the fact that he thought the school ought to change their entire schedule for Rush, for Greek Rush. How or why he thought, they would do it. But what happened is that he had been a waiter at DePauw in sorority houses, and he had overheard the conversations of the girls who talked about how they regretted their choice, that they had to make a choice before they started classes, before they met anyone, and that if they'd had it to do over, they would have made a different choice. So he persuaded, in one meeting, they voted to do it, the entire student body, to change Rush for the next year from before school started to after winter break. He also persuaded the school at some point later to rotate chairmanships so that there couldn't be any personal fiefdoms and that everybody got to share the pain. So there were 4-year rotating terms, which everyone got to share. The other thing that I think shows how every now and then he was a little clever. So being junior right off the bat, he was put on the committee for planning the Beagley Library, right over there. So one of the things he was assigned to do was the schlep work. And he was asked to measure the books in the existing library, all the existing holdings, and tell the group how much wall space, how much shelf space they needed for the books in the Beagley Library. Well, Dad actually enjoyed this. So he figured out an average, basically, of how much space they needed, and he bumped it up. He thought, why would we want to just replicate the amount of space we need now for the new library? So he never told anyone. I found this out a couple years ago. Never said a word. Nobody questioned him. Who else was going to go look? So he just exaggerated the space. He didn't double it, but he really bumped it up. So as mild-mannered as he might have looked, he had his ways. He had his ways.
Thank you, Kathy. And I'm proud to say that the changes of rush schedule and rotation of chairmanships is still existing today, thanks to your father and your husband. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Jim Long. I was the class of 73, and I was a member of a fraternity, and at least 4 of my fraternity brothers and I took Civil War and Reconstruction from Dr. Smith. I was a history major, but my concentration was British history, so that was the only class I had. But it was a class that met 5 days a week, and I made every class, which was not the common effort that I gave at the time. But there are 2 things I remember markedly about his class. Was the first thing is we had grown up with the centennial of the Civil War, so we wanted to hear about the battles, military history, etc. He started out explaining what happened to the society before the Civil War, and he explained how all the major church denominations had split over the issue of slavery. And one of the points that he made for us quite clearly, I remember in 8th grade history being taught that the issue of the Civil War was the South's right to secede. And he was vehement, honestly, about the question of slavery being the underlying cause of the American Civil War. And I went on to law school because I didn't have, I don't think, the courage to be a PhD in history. But I later changed my career. I went to the Methodist Seminary 15 years after being in law and had a career in the church. And I discovered, very much so, and I remember talking to you about some of these issues, how much the churches were affected by this issue and continue to be affected by social issues. And Dr. Smith I would see for years later, and Betty, and he was always very encouraging to me about becoming a minister, and he was very clear that his faith was also grounded in a very deep and abiding interest in the social and political issues that underline faith. So he was a wonderful man and a wonderful professor. You've heard that from many of us. And even with one class, he had a real effect on my life. And so I give thanks. And Betty and your family has meant a lot to us through the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Hey, top of the day. This is reunions. I just love it.
It is indeed a reunion, a very happy reunion, but there are also serious sides of it too. My name is David Papoy. I'm class of 1965, and a little older than some of you and quite a bit younger than a couple too, I'm happy to say. In November 1963, a shot rang out from Dallas, Texas, and took the life of John F. Kennedy. I'll just give you just a second or two to think about those of you who were on campus. Where were you? Where were you? I remember specifically where I was. My at the time girlfriend, now my wife, remembers exactly where she was, and you will as too. People were shattered, just as young people are now shattered by the more recent deaths of prominent people. But we had a savior, in a way, by the way Richard Smith dealt with it. We went to class the next day, maybe it was the day after, I really don't remember. I don't remember the name of the specific course, but he was going to be teaching something related probably to the Civil War or to Reconstruction, who knows. But no, the classroom was filled. Not every seat was, not only every seat, but also all around. But people who knew that somehow, some way, Dick Smith would heal us. I don't remember what he said, but the thing was, he did heal us. He made us feel as though we were part of history by recounting what had happened years before JFK and giving it a context in which we can all live now. Well, These things are gifts that very few people know, very few people remember. And I don't remember what he said, as I said, but I never will forget how well I felt and how good I think everybody in that classroom felt, thanks to Shotgun Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
My name is Peter Hahn. I was a member of the class of 1982 and a history major who, like Joe, was influenced by Dick Smith to pursue my PhD in history and a career in academia thereafter. My memories of Professor Smith from the campus years are like many of those shared today already. He was a taskmaster. He worked you very hard, but he was also something of a celebrity. I and all of my fellow students admired him, respected him, talked about him in the dorms late at night, about what a remarkable figure he was and how he motivated us to learn. I eventually made my way to Ohio State University, joining the faculty there in 1991, and upon that return to Central Ohio was really fortunate to be able to reestablish contact with Dick and Betty, and enjoyed meeting them or him for lunch or breakfast 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, either down in Columbus or here in Delaware. And I got to know him as an adult as a remarkable man of unlimited knowledge, unlimited compassion, unlimited grace. He was like a father figure to me, I dare say, and in fact, my own father, with whom I had an excellent relationship, was born a year after Dick and passed away just a couple of years ago. So I was blessed to have sort of 2 father figures in a sense, one very personal and meaningful, one more professional but deeply influential on my life and my thinking and my work. To sum it all up, I think what I really admired about Dick was that by his combination of disciplined expectation, that taskmaster aspect, but also his grace and his charm and his wit, he made me want to learn, and he made me want to succeed. And he did that better than any other instructor I had, and that made all the difference in the world. Like all of you, I will miss him, but I will also feel deeply blessed that I knew Dick Smith and that he knew me. Thank you.
Thank you, good sir. Appreciate that.
Hi, I'm Ellen Simpson, class of 1977. I feel like I really need to say this, especially to Kathy, who reminded me that I think to this day my EQ is substantially higher than my IQ, which was kind of common for those of us who went to college in the 70s, except for my friend Joe Klatdar and my friend Kathy Manduzik. But one of the things that I think I represent, Kathy said this, so 6,000 students, there were a lot of us who did not go on for our PhDs.
Thank you, that's good.
I too, but a year ahead of Joe, was assigned Richard Smith as my academic advisor because I felt like I was going to be majoring in history. A couple trimesters in, I realized that that probably wasn't going to work, but I was able to keep Dick as my advisor for my first 2 years of college. Perhaps a glutton for punishment, or the fact that I found the perfect professor. I took 6 of Dick's classes, and he and I proudly graduated me with a 2.78 GPA. But he truly was everything that everyone has mentioned today and more. To me, he is Ohio Wesleyan, and it's one of the reasons I'm so devoted to Ohio Wesleyan to this day.
Thank you. Thank you. I love you. And let the record show that a 2.7 from Richard Smith is a 4 point from anyone else. So you're in good shape. Anyone else? Please. All right. Top of the day, good brother.
Thank you. Well, for a change of pace, I'm not a Ohio Wesleyan grad. I'm here to represent the Adirondacks group of his many admirers. But I was a history major at Rutgers, class of 1969. Definitely not a scholar. But I'm wearing this cap, which also represents history. It's from the musical Hamilton, a great musical based on a great biography. Anyhow, I met Richard a little over 15 years ago. He was already well into his 80s, and I'm about 10 years younger than that now, and he had a hell of a lot more energy than I have now, and that was, one of the reasons I admired him. And somebody mentioned football. I know he was a fan. I'm a fan. I'm a Rutgers fan. But he took me to 2 Ohio State games in the last few years, and he was at least 90 when he took me to those games. And again, I just want to cite how much energy he had, and well, I really appreciate that he took me to those Ohio State Buckeye games.
Blessed be Rutgers. I haven't seen Betty nod her wristwatch yet, but I'm getting a signal from Kathy. Is there anyone who would like to help us close? Yes, we've got one here, and then that'll be our final tribute. I encourage you to linger after and share more if you will.
As a female student of Dick Smith's, I thought I should get up and talk about my experience with him, but I was inspired by what David said about the death of John Kennedy, because I know exactly where I was. We didn't know he had died yet at 1:30, and I was in to a class by Dave Jennings, and we went in, and I remember he didn't lecture on what he was supposed to speak. He talked about the perils of democracy. And this, to me, still I remember as something that Ohio Wesleyan gave us all the opportunity to understand and think about and challenged us. So I wasn't going to speak today, but I just had to come up and say that. But I have a couple of other memories now that all of you have sort of preempted all the things in my mind, all the anecdotes about Dick Smith, but I have a few more. So I want to tell you, I was in class, and he walked in, and he got to the podium, and he said, "My wife just had a baby. Let's push on," he said. So I don't know which of you that was. He, so I can read my writing. Oh, I was in the Civil War and Reconstruction class, but we had to get some background. We couldn't just start in the Civil War, so we began, I think, around 1840, and we ended with Dred Scott.
Yes, of course.
And so, but he did come in on a bonus Saturday and gave us a 3-hour lecture on the Battle of Antietam. Oh. So that was,
you made it through.
We made it through. And finally, because Dick and Betty both have ancestors where my husband and I ended up living in the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia, we have been privileged to see them often on their visits. But I have to tell you that I was talking to Dick one time about the Battle of Manassas, and he told me, "You have gone gray." And he didn't mean my hair. I should have said Bull Run.
Oh, thank you, dear heart.
Kathy and Betty felt that it was appropriate as part of the today's activities to read a poem, and she picked a good one for Dick, for her father. A poem by the great Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night, because if there's anyone we know that didn't go gentle into that good night, it was Richard Smith. And the poem is a villanelle. It's a short poem, 6 stanzas, and the first and third lines rhyme pretty much with the same rhyming words. And night representing death, light representing life, and then there's a final repeated line at the very end, but only 6 stanzas. And supposedly he had written it when his father was nearing death, but actually it was written in 1947. His father didn't enter his final illness for 4 or 5 years later. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave, by crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Among the many habits and intrigues that Richard and I shared, one of them was the love of poetry, and especially that one, John, thank you. Another piece of the puzzle is that Richard, for almost 40 years, would critique my faculty prayers. The first baccalaureate meeting, when I was been a chaplain for about a month, convocation, when I'd been a chaplain here only about a month, Richard came up to me and said, well, you pray an iambic pentameter. And so it is. This prayer is one that Richard asked me to use in some format because he liked both the iambic pentameter but also the spirit and theology. I share this prayer as my brother Richard has always prayed with me, and as a blessing for him and for you. Shall we pray? O God of every faith and every face, we pause to thank you for this gift of grace who richly blessed each one of us still here, as we have celebrated who he was and who he shall be, always in our hearts. Oh, blessed be. Shalom, shalom, amen.